page. Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. And the first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? We're all agreed. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our annual review of the operation of the 4th National Planning Framework. And we're joined for this item in the room by Pamela Clifford, who's the Chair of Heads of Planning Scotland, otherwise known as HOPS, and Dr. Caroline Brown, who's the Director of Scotland and Ireland Royal Town Planning Institute. And online, we're joined by Claire Simons, who's the Chair of Planning Democracy, and Neil Sutherland, who's the Founding Director at Makar Limited. I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. We're going to have about 90 minutes for this discussion. Before I turn to questions, I do want to acknowledge that planners across Scotland are doing the best that they can in changing circumstances. And I just want to put that on record because while we're scrutinising and possibly talking about the challenging situations, I just want to recognise the workers who are doing this work, very important work for us. So I'm going to start with a kind of overarching question, and Caroline, I'm going to throw it to you first. I'd be interested to understand if there's evidence that NPF4 is helping to deliver developments that actually support the 6 spatial priorities, such as compact urban growth and rural revitalisation. And if not, at this point in time, why might that be the case? Just a small question.
It is a small question, isn't it? I think the start of your question, which is about evidence, is important. And I think the answer on evidence is hard to say yes, because clearly one of the things we know about planning is it takes time, and NPF4, although it's been in situ for 2.5 years, in planning terms, that's still quite soon. And so I think there are some signs that things are changing. There are certainly conversations about the spatial principles living well locally. I think you might come on to 20-minute neighbourhoods. Those conversations are, of course, in themselves evidence that things are changing. But on the ground, I think we would have to say it's still early days. Why that might be the case, of course, is, well, because of the time lag. There are decisions in the pipeline that are being built out now, are being constructed. There are things that are being consented and granted permission, which will not yet be on the ground, and they will take several years to come to fruition. And of course, cities change very slowly, and places change quite slowly. So we also have to recognise that the way in which planning affects the built environment is a long-term one. It's not a short-term one. So seeing an impact in a very short space of time is very unlikely.
That was great. I feel like that's going to be a little bit of... We did a review last year, and that was too early, and I have a feeling that's going to be a similar thread for this session. But does anyone else want to come in on this? It's particularly around the evidence that we're seeing the 6 spatial priorities beginning to appear in urban and rural revitalisation. Pamela.
Yeah, I suppose working on the ground and working, in a planning authority and having worked in another planning authority, I do think NPF4 has definitely strengthened the hand of the planner. I agree with Caroline. It's hard to actually evidence it on the ground because developments take time to come to full fruition on that. But certainly I think, for me, biodiversity, landscape, climate change is really at the forefront now. Often in the past, landscaping and biodiversity was seen as an afterthought. and now we're seeing developers coming forward with proposals that this is at the forefront of it. Also, in terms of the sort of presumption in favour of brownfield land, on that, again, I'm a real supporter of the use of brownfield land. Again, that's strengthening the hand of the planning authorities, and I know we'll go on to it later on that, but certainly I think, you know, the new LDPs coming forward will be actually different from what we've had previously, and certainly I think we would like to see a lot of focus on sort of the use of brownfield land, vacant sites and vacant sort of buildings, and I know that will go on probably later as well. Like, you know, MPF4 is a big document on that. It is ambitious and bold, but with such a document, there are obviously shortcomings, and it takes time to work through those shortcomings.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And Neil, I think you want to come in.
Thanks very much, and hello everyone. Just to clarify my position, actually, I am not currently a director of Macar Limited. I'm the founder. I'm 4 months into a sabbatical break, so that's given me a chance to reflect on a few things after many decades. So my experience really is in rural Scotland, remote rural Scotland, and rural revitalisation being one of the 6 principles. It couldn't be more urgent, really. The context is a housing emergency, a nature emergency, and there's a great deal that could actually happen in terms of furthering those ambitions if we had adequate housing in parts of rural Scotland. So it's a significant issue. Probably the principal headwind really holding back economic development in the north. And there's been, we may indeed come on to this. You know, my remit is here is to, like yourself, Ariane, to support the planning system as best I can. I totally recognise the challenges, the difficulties in relation to planning and planners. However, the way in which MPF4 has been rolled out over the past few years has been very problematic indeed for rural developments. And I can go into some detail on that if you wish. But are things getting better? Well, indeed, they will. It's unfortunate the timing after the pandemic and then after Brexit and things. And I'm not sure how to say this subtly, but the way in which things were brought in affected my business. So we're essentially a housing provider. We're a manufacturer. And it had a significant negative impact on our business to the point where we lost a great deal of work, potential work. So are things recovering? I want us to be optimistic, but I have to put it on record to say that it's the rolling out of the National Planning Framework has been extremely problematic for certain businesses, some of which have not survived as a result of it. That may sound a bit dramatic, but it's the way I see it.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think we'll be asking questions throughout the morning that will probably tease out some more of that. And Claire, come on in.
Hello. Yeah, I think, NPF4 is full of good intentions, but there's not always the wider mechanisms to help deliver those. And I think in terms of delivery, it would be good to focus on things like resourcing planning. I know there's been a lot of talk about resourcing planning, but where that resourcing is going, is it just going to the development management side, for example, or is it helping with the policy side or the enforcement side, or the broader mechanisms of helping to, for example, biodiversity officers in local authorities to help support those planning decisions to make sure that the approvals are good approvals, so that then that lays the ground for good delivery on the ground. And in terms of monitoring, I would like to see more emphasis on whether we are delivering good outcomes. I see a lot of focus on delivering lots of approvals, how quickly we're doing, the speed and the efficiency of the planning system, but less work being done on the very difficult task of how we're monitoring whether that is actually delivering the development where we need and whether it's delivering quality development. And I would like to see much more work being done on that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go into an area around the climate and biodiversity elements of NPF4, because that was something that people were very excited about, and I think it's already been mentioned. I think, Pamela, you already mentioned it this morning, but the committee's heard current concerns that a lack of guidance on assessing the climate and biodiversity impact of new developments is hampering the delivery of NPF4 policy goals in these areas. And I'd be interested to hear if you share those concerns. And maybe, Pamela, I'll start with you. Do you share these concerns? And also why, if it is the case, is it taking so long to produce this guidance, and why was it not ready for the launch of these policies?
Yeah, I think that's one of the shortcomings. We've got pretty strong policies in terms of climate change and biodiversity, but we don't actually have the guidance behind that. And I think, different planning authorities are interpreting it different ways on that. I can't really speak of why it's taken this long. Certainly some planning authorities are using the biodiversity matrix, which is from England on that. Others are just interpreting themselves. And certainly I agree with the lady from Planning Democracy about the fact of, are we monitoring this on that? And I think that would be quite important to see how that is being interpreted on the ground by different planning authorities. Planners like guidance, I will say that. In terms of the policy, as do our elected members as well, when we're putting forward recommendations to them on that. So definitely guidance would be of assistance in terms of interpretation of the policies. Certainly, NPF4 was quite a shift because previously policies were done at the local planning authority stage, now at the national stage. So it's it's more difficult to speak about, well, what did you mean when you actually put together that policy, and I think guidance would assist that. I know that we've got the national skills commitment plan on that, and that is rolling out training on various aspects of the policies of NPF4, but it doesn't actually replace providing guidance on the ground.
Okay, great. Thank you. Claire, you've indicated you want to come in, and then I'll go to Caroline.
Yes, I think we had some very good training from Nature Scotland. We put on our nature and planning webinar series this last winter, and Stuart Bentz from Nature Scot. He's one of the people who are writing the guidance. He very kindly came and gave us a very good session indicating what he was doing. And this is just the guidance that he's working on for local developments, not major developments. That's the government guidance. But it was clear from that it's immensely complex, and he's got a lot of work. But I think he was working on it something like one day a week. There was hardly any officers actually helping to produce the guidance, so I think that might be one of the reasons. But it was very useful what he was saying about putting out a matrix to demonstrate whether or not you're delivering biodiversity mitigation or enhancement. And I think that's something that's really needed, because those two are getting kind of conflated, that we feel in some of the decisions. So the other issue, I think, is around training. So I mentioned our nature and planning webinar series, but we're not getting a feel that there's a lot of training going on, particularly on biodiversity issues. And it was indicative that quite a few people that were planners and professionals were coming to our training and are thinking, why is a small NGO covering this when perhaps it should be being delivered by others? So I'm not quite sure how much training there is, and especially with the councillors as well. I spoke to a few councillors, and I'm not sure that that's being rolled out, the training for councillors. And when it is, it doesn't seem to be monitored as to whether they're actually doing it. It's left up to them themselves to be doing it. And that one of them says he doesn't remember biodiversity being mentioned at all. So I think training might be an issue. I'd like to come in later, perhaps, about talking about conditions, but I won't, biodiversity conditions, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. I've got a question for you on that coming up shortly. Caroline.
Thank you. We've had some guidance that was published last week on Policy 3, which is on climate resilience. So we have finally got something, but we've only just got it. I was involved in that as part of the technical advisory group, so I saw some of the behind the scenes. But yes, it's taken us 2+ years to get that guidance on one of the headline policies in NPF4. And I think this comes back to, and we share the concern of HOPS around the length of time. And I think something about the communications and transparency about the work that is happening and who is doing it. So Claire mentioned work of Nature Scott producing the guidance on biodiversity. And we understand there have been conversations about this and some potential timelines which go well into 2026 for this guidance around biodiversity enhancement. And I think that is a resourcing issue. Scottish Government are aware of this. There have been conversations about how we can bring this forward and speed things up. But yes, this, resourcing, not just in planning authorities, but in our key agencies supporting planning decisions as statutory consultees, and in this case, producing the guidance that's needed to help officers, developers, members on the ground make the decisions. And I think Pamela's point about being able to interrogate the policy writers to understand the intention is critical here. There are, I'm sure we will discuss them, a number of policies where there's a lot of discussion about the wording and the exact intention, and having a conversation about that is really important to all of the people, all of the stakeholders, to actually move things forward, to deliver it on the ground in the way that is intended. And that isn't always the case at the moment. I think coming back to these two key policies, it's the flagship of NPF4. NPF4 is all about these things. So why are they so slow in getting this guidance to our colleagues, our members working on the ground? It's kind of hard to fathom in some ways. Having said that, I know that the climate resilience policy guidance does include some research. So some research was done to help inform that. And again, having an understanding about the work that's going on would be helpful. Because clearly, if there is benchmarking going on or research happening, that has to come before the guidance can be issued. But it's quite a black box, understanding what's taking so long.
Okay, do you think, in terms of creating that opportunity, interrogate is quite a strong word, but that opportunity to discuss with the people who've written the different policies, do you think that that's something that the government should perhaps roll out as a session similar to what Planning Democracy and APRS have done, where there's a couple of hours or 90 minutes where there's a bit of a show and tell, and then people can ask questions, and they could go across all 33 of the policies, and then potentially even talk about the national policies, but just something that, because it does feel like there's a bit of a void and a lot of kind of wondering going on.
Yes, I think that would be really valuable, and that has been suggested in relation to the National Planning Hub, actually creating opportunities for local authorities to come and have, if you like, a safe space to ask questions about how are we interpreting this, what do you think that means, and talking to the Scottish Government about those specific policies.
Okay,
Yeah.
so something to recommend there, I think. Okay, Claire, I'm going to come back to you. Actually, on what you pointed out there. So you in your evidence, you highlighted planning democracy highlighted concerns about overall resilience on planning conditions to deliver biodiversity goals, arguing that conditions are often not complied with and enforcement action is relatively rare. Are conditions? So I'd be interested to know if you have a sense that conditions are flouted, and if so, what needs to happen to increase compliance with planning conditions.
Thank you. I'd like to refer also to some other evidence that has been produced by Dr. Kira Chapman and Professor Malcolm Tate from Sheffield University, because they provided some very important evidence around their work on monitoring whether planning conditions are being adhered to. And sad to say that it was very, very poor. The results, sometimes only 34% of overall, they found that 34% of planning conditions were actually being delivered on the ground. And I think that's something that we really need to be improving upon, is looking at what is happening on the ground, because whilst there might be a lot of work being done on the paperwork side of things, and it looking as if everything's very busy and that biodiversity is being acknowledged and worked on, the actual on the ground delivery of any conditions is very much to be. Well, their research was in England, but it's leaves a lot to be desired. So I think what we're needing to see is to put in more effective and resourced ecological enforcement in place, so making sure that those biodiversity conditions are enforced. Perhaps seeing less reliance on conditions. It's difficult to tell, but I don't think I've ever seen biodiversity given as a reason to go against the principle of development and refuse permission, even if it's having a clear impact on nature. And we are seeing permissions still being granted post NPF4 where there's a clear impact on nature. And I've seen planners and developers scrabbling around trying to get enhancements when it's clear that actually that development should never have been permitted in the first place. And we would like to see far more ecological training for planners, so that they understand how to write robust conditions, because I think some of it is in the writing, and understanding things like how do you write in that you're delivering something in perpetuity for biodiversity into a condition, and who's going to do that? Who's going to be responsible for that? And another worrying concern that we've seen in a couple of planning conditions on some of the developments we've been looking at is the reliance on communities to deliver the biodiversity enhancements. So these might be, there's been no discussion with the community beforehand, but the idea is that planning conditions say that, yes, you can gift some of the land to the community, and they will cover the up to 80% of the biodiversity enhancements. There's no talk of whether or not they want to do that, or how that's going to be resourced. This has sometimes been in areas of multiple deprivation, so I don't know how they're supposed to be doing that. But that's one of the ways that they've been saying, yes, we're delivering on that. So I think there's much more thinking needs to be going into writing conditions. They also come at the end of the planning process, and sometimes, the work needs to be done much more upfront. We're seeing, for example, there was an example of a condition that states a pre-works walkover survey to check for the presence of badger sets was being put in a condition, whereas you would think that that kind of work should have been done before they just made decisions about where the roads were going to go and so on. So, yeah, much more upfront work, I think, we would like to see in those kind of circumstances. I'm going on. There's more in my evidence, so I could carry on, or shall I?
Well, I mean, I've got a follow-up question there, because that's very helpful. But I think we've heard some in some of the written evidence situations where you have ancient woodland that is being cut down in order to bring in housing. Now, and Neil said very clearly at the beginning, we've got this challenge where we've got the nature emergency and the housing emergency, and how do we square that? But do you have a sense that there's understanding within planning departments that cutting down ancient woodland, which is serves as a considerable climate and biodiversity resource, or sequestering in a way, that if you cut that down, is irreplaceable? Replacing it with a few trees here and there, it's not a like for like replacement. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I wouldn't like to judge what the knowledge of the planners, and I'm sure that they are very knowledgeable. I think as a whole, everybody, which is one of the reasons we did our training, was that everybody, I think we don't maybe fully appreciate how ecology works. We're very distanced from it nowadays, which was one of the reasons why we were encouraging people to go out and record biodiversity in their own areas, to kind of encourage that understanding and knowledge. But I think planners, they need to be able to prioritise nature as well as understand it. And when we've seen the rhetoric coming back, a little sliding of the rhetoric, for example, in the programme for government, it's a restatement that planning needs to be at the heart of economic growth, and we're coming back to this focus on delivering economic growth rather than delivering good planning as a whole. That feels as if there's a backsliding on the rhetoric, and that makes it, I think, hard for planners to make difficult decisions. If the pressure is on to deliver development or to deliver housing, and that is seen as the priority, then it's very difficult for them to make a decision about that, whether or not they understand the complexities of how an ancient woodland cannot be replaced by a little bit of tree planting, and that those ecosystems are substantially more than that.
Okay, thanks. And then Neil, you indicated you want to come on, and then I'm going to move on to questions from Mark Griffin. Hang on a minute. I think your mic's not up yet.
Okay.
That's it.
Can you hear me now?
On. Yep, great.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, what I'd like to say is that it's not an either or in terms of development proposals. It's not. There's this tendency to assume that development is negative. It can actually deliver biodiversity enhancement as a core benefit of the development. And indeed, there could be something to be said for active support for applications, for proposals that are based on biodiversity enhancement as well as development itself. And that's what we really need to move towards. I mean, the context of Scotland, particularly the Highlands, has been well known. I mean, it's what was it Frank Fraser-Darling said in his introduction in 1952? He used the term of devastated terrain. We have a big job to do in terms of ecosystem health and enhancement, and there's no getting around that. Due to the historical kind of context. So there's and things are improving. You can't drive through or walk indeed through the hills and not see woodland establishment, this type of thing. So things are actually moving, but there's a great deal more we can do But every time there's a discussion around this, it tends to come up this idea that we have to destroy something in order to develop. It's not necessarily the case. And I think that it's worth saying, actually, with a lot of smaller scale rural development, biodiversity enhancement is simply, it comes along with that development. It actually improves the kind of net gain with that type of development. So I just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. And if either of you want to come in on this stuff, maybe you can tuck it into find other places to bring it in. Brilliant. Okay. Mark, you've got a couple of questions.
Yep, thanks, Convener. Good morning. Maybe come to you first, Pamela. I just wanted to ask about the new minimum all-tenure housing land requirement in NPF4, and I just wondered if the introduction of those Matlar figures had led to identification of how that impacted on the identification of land for housing.
I think there's been a lot of discussion around that, and certainly from Homes for Scotland, as well as working with Hobbs. I think, again, it's quite early to sort of determine the outcome of that, because we're all just in the middle of starting our new LDPs. Some of us are more sort of ahead than sort of others on that. I think it's something that, we will have to work together with Homes for Scotland to take it sort of forward on that. So I can't really give you a straight answer at this stage, because, again, I think, just as I said, we need to work through that.
Do you have an idea of the figures that are coming through the various planning authorities in terms of, the Scottish Government have been very clear that it's a minimum. Have planning authorities been, bringing forward the minimum +1? Are they bringing forward the minimum plus 10%, 20%, 30%? Do you have an idea of what is coming through each planning authority?
Yeah, I know that there has been discussions about the figures, because in my previous authority we actually got quite a low sort of level required, and so did a neighbouring planning authority, and we actually pushed back on that and seen sort of an improvement on that. To be honest, I don't really have that information before me about sort of how individual planning authorities are taking forward their numbers. I think they're largely, sticking to sort of the minimum of going sort of forward.
Thanks. Caroline, you have any comment on?
I think there is a huge variety in the numbers that are coming forward, and I think MAFLA +1 is definitely, I think we can all probably work out which authorities, or there's at least one authority that's gone in that direction. But I've also heard some authorities have been much, much more generous in terms of their allocation. So it's a wide range, I think. But still, I mean, there's been lots of calls for sites, and so some authorities are still working through a lot of this in their LDP process.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Claire, would like to come in. Claire.
Yes, it's interesting. I'm wondering what's behind the question, because the minimum all-tenure housing land supply, housing land requirement figures is very much based on a system that requires us to, deliver a lot of land to developers to build on, and yet we have a huge amount of permissions of land that is already been allocated and permissioned for housing. 164,000 permissions have been granted. So I don't know why there's always this focus on how much land we are delivering rather than what is actually being built out, because it's really, the Matlar is really a continuation of relying on the private sector house builders to produce new supply of housing. And it continues wrongly to see that the best way of resolving the housing emergency is through the private sector. And so the Honda, say like Fife Honda, the housing needs and demand assessment, that's for 4,200 units. The MATLA requires you to increase the amount by up to 74%, actually. So you inbuilt this generosity figure so that you allocate a lot more land than is actually needed. So for 4,200 units, you're asking for 7,300 units, enough land for that. And then the local housing land requirement is even bigger than that. And for this one, it's 9,400. So you're increasing the amount of land and unit-wise by 124% over the Honda. And that the justification is because market conditions means that some planned developments probably won't go forward for some reasons. So more land needs to be allocated than is really needed. And this is really a highly, highly inefficient way of doing things. So much large amount of land being allocated really makes it difficult for us to know, produces uncertainty as to where to target the infrastructure, for example. And that's at odds with any sort of planned route towards a zero carbon future. So, you know, the question we could ask perhaps of the housing developers is, you know, how much land would they like for the housing emergency to be over? How much land would need to be allocated for that to be over? And the answer to that is rhetorical, because it's never, because their business plans are based on them having more and more land. You know, it's a bit of a gravy train for them. So we need to perhaps be asking who's benefiting from this approach of allocating loads of land to the developers and the private sector to deliver housing. And is it better perhaps to start thinking of alternative ways? And the Scottish Land Commission, even the markets. Competitive markets, CMA, the CMA, I've forgotten what you call it. They are recommended that we do much more land assembly and enable local authorities to deliver more housing themselves through land assembly mechanisms and compulsory purchase orders, and, you know, allowing much more direct delivery of housing so that we're not having to allocate quite so much land. So I would say please focus on how much is actually getting built out rather than how much land we are allocating.
Okay, thanks for that. My second question was just more generally on the introduction of NPF4 and all the policies contained within that document in the context of a housing emergency. Do you see us delivering more houses under the NPF4 framework than we would have done previously under the previous version? Caroline first.
It's an impossible question, isn't it? Look, I'd like to say yes. I think one of the things that strikes me is that NPF4 was finalised before the housing emergency was declared. Now, the housing emergency, we all know, did not arrive overnight. And we were all acutely aware of the issues around housing delivery at that point. But NPF4 doesn't have housing emergency in it. That is subsequent to NPF4 being adopted. So there's something in that, I think, about does there need to be any tweaking to NPF4 to recognise that? And that is a political decision, I think. I don't think it's for a planner like me to say, but I think there is a question about that. And of course, NPF4 is about the policies, what things should look like. It isn't about the delivery. It doesn't control the financial context. It doesn't control the price of land. It doesn't control, you know, the appetite of investors. It does not control some of the non-land-based things which affect housing delivery. For example, the housing bill. And we know that the prospect of rent controls has affected investment decisions, and planning permissions that are in place for certain types of development will not now come forward because the investors behind those schemes have walked away. And that's to do with other policy, not to do with planning and not to do with NPF4. So I think we also have to address that. So it isn't all about planning policy, housing delivery, it's about other things too. And that has an impact on the deliverability of housing through NPF4. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Pamela?
I also think it's not just down to numbers, it's about quality of housing. And that's something I feel strongly about, that we're not building the ghettos of the future and we're not back in 20, 30 years knocking those houses down on that. So for me, NPF4 allows us to push for sort of placemaking, getting the good open space, getting the sort of addressing the net zero. I think also in terms of policy 16, which is quite a sort of robust policy on that, it allows planning authorities through the new LDPs to revisit sites that have been in local development plans for 10, 20 years, to go and examine those sites and say, are they viable or not? And if they haven't been taken forward in that period and there's no prospect of them being taken forward, then they come out of the new LDP and it allows maybe an alternative site to be taken forward. So probably going back to your question, hopefully that NPF4 allows us to provide more housing going forward. Obviously, the policy also allows for affordable housing, and I think, the lack of public subsidy coming forward certainly has been a barrier of taking affordable housing forward. I'm finding that developers are very willing to provide affordable housing, but there's an issue with whether it's the council taking forward the affordable housing or an RSL taking forward, that they don't have the financial mechanisms at present to take that forward. And I suppose we have to look at how can we deliver more affordable housing without public subsidy, and that is a big issue to resolve and take forward.
Neil and then Claire.
Yeah, hi, thanks again. Yeah, I think the quick answer in relation to rural and remote rural Scotland is absolutely more housing. As a set of a retake on national priorities, NPF4 is a significant step forward in addressing more rural housing in a wider area, wider context, including areas that have been previously inhabited, which aren't now. This then links to the previous discussion about biodiversity enhancement, ecological restoration, etc. So I think there's a terrific opportunity. I think it's only starting to become obvious, I think, without naming too many local authorities that I work in the north. I think there's a sort of residual cultural kind of feeling about a resistance to housing in areas, and as long as it's baked into Policy 17, Section C3, to be specific. In remote rural Scotland, which is defined as more than half an hour's drive from a population of a settlement of 10,000 people, which is more or less everywhere in the Highlands apart from around Inverness. There's a presumption in favour of development. And I think, coupled with the very positive things that can happen with development, I think it's a terrific opportunity to actually get new settlements, new opportunities throughout the Highlands and Islands And I think that needs to be one of the goals that we're positive about in the months and years ahead. And this needs to be discussed more widely, because I think at the moment there hasn't been enough promotion, enough understanding within the communities that the opportunities now exist within planning, because there's been such a headwind over most of my working life, the last 30 odd years. It's been very, very difficult to get housing in remote rural Scotland, and NPF4 encourages it, as far as I can see.
Okay, and
Thanks.
Claire. Thanks, Claire.
Yes, thank you. It was the Competition and Markets Authority. That was who I was trying to think of. They're the ones that are saying that the speculative housing model means that private house builders do not collectively have the necessary incentives to build houses at the rate required to meet policymakers' objectives. So that was what I was trying to say earlier. But in terms of carbon emissions, I think it's really important to recognise that if you, for example, built out all the houses that they're recommending down in England, the 300,000 housings, you're going to blow your entire carbon budget. That's predicted to consume 113% of England's cumulative carbon budget. So there is a massive implication of new build on carbon budgets. So perhaps planning authorities will be best required to identify potential buildings to reuse, perhaps, and move us away from focusing on new build to reusing existing buildings. There's 40,000 empty homes in Scotland and 24,000 second homes. Maybe we need to be looking at reusing and these sorts of things as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to say on that last point there around using existing buildings, I think the government has finally recognised that, and we did get that £40 million in the most recent budget, which was for local authorities that declared housing emergencies, and also the budget for empty homes officers increased from £500,000 to £2 million. So I think that's a good sign. I'd say that one of the challenges that we do have around using existing buildings is the fact that we have VAT on retrofit, and everybody nods their heads in Scotland, and our hands are a bit tied around what we can do about that. And I think it doesn't make sense when we need to be actually looking at using our existing buildings. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to bring in Megan Gallagher. And Megan, if you could ask all your questions, and then Alexander, I'll bring you in afterwards.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. My question is on targets for house building, because we are in a housing emergency. We've got a severe housing shortage, and we have got a situation where demand completely outstrips supply, and that's within all different markets of the housing sector as well. I was quite interested in terms of what Claire had to say in relation to the 40,000 empty homes and the 24,000 second homes. I understand the points that she's raising, but even if those homes were to be brought back into use, that wouldn't even touch the sides of what we are dealing with in terms of the demand for housing at present and the need to build more homes if we are going to tackle the housing emergency as a whole. On that point, Homes for Scotland have asked for a minimum target to be established of 25,000 new homes to be built each year. How would that work, given that NPF4 has a presumption for brownfield sites, which of course are more costly to build on? They have got serious issues in relation to treating ground. And when you're looking at brownfield sites, they tend to be smaller development areas, and they're not necessarily the larger areas that developers might need to tackle the housing needs within those particular areas. And I'm not sure who wants to kick off with that one. Will I maybe go to Pamela, please?
Okay. Certainly, I'm a great supporter, passionate about brownfield sites. As you said, they're often quite difficult to take forward, but they're usually sites that are in the best location on that. They're probably adjacent to town centres, but also key services on that. Certainly, yeah, it is difficult to deliver these sites, but my goodness, when you do deliver it, it is great sort of satisfaction of doing that. And I suppose I can only talk from my own experience in Western Bartonshire, where we had a very active private house builder who was interested in sort of brownfield sites, and we had some real successes of bringing them forward. However, it is difficult to do that nationally, and also sort of meet that sort of minimum target of of new houses to address the housing emergency. But it just doesn't mean that you actually allocate greenfield sites as well, because then you have that sort of competition between the greenfield sites, which are usually easier to develop, although getting more difficult when you have sort of infrastructure requirements on that. I suppose, planning authorities, councils need to work much closer with the private sector, with house builders, to bring those forward on that. And just speaking to them, there's probably need for some form of subsidy to take it forward, to kickstart these sites. But my goodness, what they bring to the area in terms of new life to town centres on that, but also in terms of the fact, as I said, they're much better located. And certainly, one thing, we're all living longer on that, but maybe our health and our mobility isn't as great. And I think, we need to sort of consider that in terms of how we're providing these housing sites. We need to bring more sort of central housing sites, which are much more closer to existing services.
Anyone else want to? Yes.
I think we completely support brownfields first as a policy, and for all of the reasons Pamela outlines. But of course that, as you acknowledge, that adds complexity and it adds time. And I think that's the tricky thing in relation to targets. The planning system delivers the consent, allocates the land, delivers the consents, but it doesn't control the building process. But we know that there's, conditions that need to be discharged, and there's often a lot of technical work that goes on once a planning permission has been granted before the construction happens. And sometimes those contamination or brownfield land, contaminated sites, that can take quite considerable amount of time as well as money to get those resolved before housing or new development can be delivered. And that's not always knowable ahead of time. So I think there's some difficulties about that. And I think, as I said before, there are some issues around delivery which are outside the control of the planning system. And we are very good friends with Homes for Scotland, but I think, as Claire and others have intimated, they have an interest in, maintaining their profits. And so building lots of houses very quickly might not meet that need. So we also have to recognise that side of it, that they want to phase their developments and guarantee their returns and their work stream. So there's a tension between setting a target and delivering it. Planning doesn't control all of that, doesn't control all of those things. And I think those points about, public sector funding for affordable housing and who takes that on. There's, again, these non-planning related issues around finance, which can get in the way of some of those, and again, can hold things up in terms of delivery on the ground. I just want to acknowledge there's some excellent work that's been going on with the Improvement Service to build dashboards that show where things have got to on housing land. So the sites that are allocated, the sites that are constructed, the sites that are under construction and are coming forward. And I think that's a really helpful tool for planners, developers, but members of the public and members to actually have a sense of what's happening in their local authority area. Those sorts of, that visibility, that transparency point that I mentioned earlier, I think is you know, really useful to have that, and there's some excellent work happening to make that sort of thing visible to all of us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, and then Claire, online.
Yes, I would very much agree with Caroline and Pam on these points. But I think that I'm not an expert on this, of course, but I think, you know, the indication that if you, the public sector, get involved in the purchase and assembly of land for development, you know, they can recoup their money up from their upfront investments on that land. And so I think there's a lot of good research being done on how we might get, you know, governments to have much more direct delivery of non-market housing. I think it's you know, so that perhaps governments take on the risk a little bit more than the developers. And then there's really exciting stuff that could be done. You know, allowing sort of, rather than having the public-private partnerships, you know, considering public-community partnership. And, you know, there's some really good stuff being done on land reform, community empowerment, and hopefully on the local governance review as well, to sort of, if these could all be combined with the planning considerations, then we could maybe get some really good, genuine community power and community involvement and help shape public investment, maybe linking in with local place plans, and to actually have some community-led development through maybe master plan consent areas, maybe perceiving of them a different way than they're being considered at the moment, as a way of kind of simplifying planning rather than using them as an opportunity to create these exciting new partnerships that might help deliver, you know, housing in a way that we've not been for 20 to 30 years by relying too much on the private sector.
Can I just come in with a quick supplementary there, Claire? Because again, community empowerment, completely supportive of what you're saying. You know, making sure that our communities are absolutely involved in development plans. Of course, we've got the local place plans that communities are very much involved in. But can I ask, if you're saying that we're not going to rely on the private sector, who's going to fund the public side of things? Because I think this is where the stickler is. You've got local government who are, you know, that they're completely up against it in terms of their own finances. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are there in terms of not having private but having public funded finance for this. I don't think you can do one without the other, and we very much need the private sector to tackle the housing emergency.
Yes, that's kind of like what I was meaning about. I think there's ways that they can, the losses or the upfront investment could be recouped, maybe through greater capture of the uplift from the land values and so on. I'm not an expert on that, but there is good work being done around it, and I can certainly follow up with some recommendations of where to go and who to speak to, because I totally understand that there isn't the money around, but you know, relying on something, a system that is clearly not delivering development, housing. You know, we have a housing emergency, and yet we have big volume house builders making vast, supernormal profits, you know, with gross profit margins of up to 34%. There's a mismatch there, and so you know, it is. We've got to square that circle. So I think it's if the willingness is there to look at it and to explore it and be, you know, rather than keep on focusing on listening to you know, the needs of the housing builders, but you know, actually listening to communities, because they don't have a voice. They don't have a voice in planning. We don't have any rights in planning, and you know, improving those rights and opportunities is part of the answer, I think.
And Neil.
The opportunity, I think, just to build on Pamela's points about brownfield sites and others, indeed, Part of the issue is we're overly reliant on the large house builders in the UK and in Scotland. They don't operate in rural areas. You're possibly aware of that. And it's small to medium-sized companies which have reduced in number, who are more likely to take on these smaller sites and make a good job of them, quite frankly. The other point I wanted to make really was that construction and the way buildings are delivered, housing is changing significantly. So with my Offsite Solutions Scotland network hat on, the company I founded is a member of this network, and the manner in which housing is being delivered and linking up these wider social, economic and environmental considerations that are fundamental to strategic planning, we can be using local supply chains, particularly timber supply chains in Scotland, to deliver very high quality housing. That addresses Claire's point, I think, about carbon budgets, because it's possible to actually capture more sequestrated carbon within these buildings than we actually produce in their delivery. And we have proven that's the case. So this can actually be part of the solution for net zero, not part of the problem. But we have to do things differently. And it's that definition of madness, isn't it? You know, we expect a different outcome, but we keep using the same method. So there are different ways to produce buildings. And the key to this is public procurement, or indeed private-public partnerships and community partnerships together. And I think it's an exciting area. We probably don't have time to talk about that very much more this morning, but believe me, there's a lot of very interesting things happening in how to actually deliver very high-quality performance housing at equal or lower cost to that is being delivered today, because of the business models that are being foisted on and the procurement models that are being foisted on us by the big housing delivery organisations. I'll probably get myself into big trouble, but I don't mind, because it has to be said, frankly. So I think it's the small to medium companies that are doing the innovation. They're working on these things, using local supply chains, using upskilling young people and delivering better outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'll try and put the last two questions together,
Okay,
convener, because
thanks.
they're on the same issue. We have spoken a lot about out-of-date local development plans this morning, in terms of the length of time it takes to draft and adopt new LDPs. So if anyone wants to expand on those points in terms of what we can do to accelerate the process of that. And then, of course, we've also heard about the overly rigid interpretation of MPF4 policies, of course, either contained within MPF4 or outside of it, that stifles development. And of course, one example of that could be 20-minute neighbourhood policies to remote rural developments. So I'm just wanting to see if anyone wants to expand any more on those points, because I think they're really important in terms of the future of LDPs and where we go with them. Caroline, I think you've indicated.
Yeah, I'm going to say what you expect me to say about LDPs, which is there's a resourcing issue. We know this. I think I'm sure Pamela will come in, because I know HOPS have been doing some work around LDP teams, but it's really concerning to hear that there are a number of authorities with tiny groups of people, you know, 2 or 3 officers who are responsible for bringing the LDP to fruition. And clearly that's part of the problem. So it's a resourcing problem. The housing emergency has meant that there's been a lot of focus on housing and housing delivery, and a lot of attention and resources being pushed in that direction, and possibly to the detriment of other things. And of course, we know across the sector that planners are in demand in a number of places, not least the energy sector. And so that has affected the ability of local authorities to keep hold of planning teams, planning numbers, and bring their LDPs forward. I think just in terms of the processes around LDPs, I'm a great fan of the word evidence. Ariane started with evidence in her first question, and I think there's definitely some scope for some work around what is happening in LDPs in terms of the processes, and are the new LDPs actually happening in the way that was envisaged, or are people, and there are some suggestions that some authorities are trying to kind of rewrite all of the policies of NPF4. I can think of one planner saying to me, my colleague thinks they have to rewrite everything, and I'm telling them no. So I think there's some of these things which are part of potentially the reason things are taking time and slipping. But I'm going to give Pamela time because I know Hops have been talking about this.
Yeah. Important to get an up-to-date local development plan. I work with an up-to-date local development plan with current authority, previous authority. We couldn't get an LDP through on 2 occasions because of a very controversial site on that. It just makes it sort of much easier if it's up-to-date on that, and also for developers, and it just gives that much better, robust decision-making. In terms of, as Caroline said, there has been some work started, and I think there's more work to be done on that. There is a lot of LDP slippage because these teams for LDPs are often 2-3 people, and they also have other sort of duties like local review body, TPOs, stopping up orders, core paths, as well as sometimes also a regeneration aspect to it. On that, there is the sort of deadline of May 2028. A lot of authorities will struggle to make that deadline because a lot of the evidence reports have not gone through the gate checks, so they've lost time there, never mind the resourcing of those sort of local authorities on that, taking it sort of forward on that. I suppose that there has been a lot of sort of concentration, a lot of sort of resource looking at development management. I think probably local development plans, and that's the key. We work under a plan-led system. On that, we need to resource those teams sort of taking forward, and I agree with what Caroline's saying. And again, I think there's some work to be done with probably through HOPS, RTPI and Scottish Government about how we want the new LDPs to look. Like we've got policy at that national level, we shouldn't be duplicating that policy at a local level and only deviating it to meet sort of local needs on that. Just something that I think maybe we should be taking forward is how can we actually have a more digital local development plan. We don't need these big documents on that, given that we have that strong policy focus from MPF4 on that. Can we look at much more slimline, more engaging documents? Our communities don't want these big documents on that. They want to go online. They want to see the development proposals, our thoughts of how those are taken forward, as does sort of developers. So I think going forward and looking towards 2028, there is a lot of work to be done around that to bring those LDPs forward to the sort of the style and the format that we all want.
I'm going to bring in Claire. Before I do, I'm just going to say we're going to all have to become a bit more succinct. We're about halfway through our questions, but more than halfway through our time. But I think it's all been very important, so not to... I just want to support that, and that's why I've allowed that. But I think just a notification for everyone. We might roll past 11 o'clock at this point. Claire.
Development plans, they're 10-year plans now. So my feeling is that they shouldn't be hurried and they need to be right. And the processes of deciding what's going to get allocated where, I think, needs to be overseen by communities. During the Planning Act 2019, all that we were advocating for an equal right of appeal, which we felt would help ensure that the plan-led system is adhered to. We were told, no, we'll have much more front-loading. People are going to get much more involved in local development plans, and then they won't need to have a right of appeal at the end of the process, because they will have had a control and influence on what goes into local development plans. However, we see a lot of work and a lot of focus on local place plans, but I'm not really seeing resources or any interesting techniques. You know, you could have a citizens' assembly around what sites get allocated, for example. There's just not this happening, and I totally agree that, you know, there's not the resourcing for this. It's probably not that planners don't want to do it, but you know, they just don't have the time. So, you know, communicating with you know, community development workers or whatever, I think it's really important that communities absolutely have a stake in those local development plans.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Alexander.
Thank you. It would be good to get an attitude from you what the impact of the adoption of NPF4, and we've had a plethora of associated working groups and guidance and advice, and how that has had on the ability for communities to meaningfully engage with the planning system. And would you say it's helped or it's hindered with the development of local place plans? Maybe Pamela first.
Yeah, I think that, again, I think there's some work to be done regarding local place plans. Certainly in some authorities, it's a rather cluttered landscape on that, and it's really difficult for communities to actually understand it. LDP, often there's community action plans and local place plans, but I do see local place plans as critical, and it's for the community to influence local development plans going forward. In fact, I had a conversation yesterday with the community, just pointing that out to them about how important it is for them to put together a local place plan. Again, going back to the conversation about the local development plan, it doesn't need to be a long document. It can be a few pages on that. It can be done digitally on that, where they're identifying their proposals and they're identifying sites that they would like to see taken forward. But again, there is a resourcing issue on that. You know, focus at present is LDPs, of getting that, trying to meet that or near that target of May 2028 on that. And often communities actually just need some sort of capacity building on that, and sometimes that isn't happening in councils due to resourcing.
Caroline?
Yeah, you know, we see the power of local place plans there. They have enormous potential, and there are some wonderful examples of communities that have worked on fantastic, engaged, co-produced local place plans that are really giving them a platform to do lots of things for themselves, as well as to help shape the agenda of others, including landowners, for example. You know, a community coalescing around a local place plan can persuade a local landowner to release the land that they've been sitting on and has been allocated for a while, and to release that land for development. So they can be enormously powerful, but we share the concerns about complexity. The scope of local place plans varies from place to place. The resource required, of course, the unevenness of take-up, the timelines as well, in conjunction with the local development plan. Not all communities will have a local place plan up front of the LDP. So there's lots of those things, but they do give a concrete opportunity for communities to be engaged in the future of their place, and gives them a meaningful output for that. But we have to have some recognition about how we, you know, what happens to it then. And again, ongoing support, ongoing resources needed. So, yeah, there's a lot of potential. And I think there are some fantastic examples, just to counter Claire's point about engagement in planning. I'm going to point to Glasgow City Council. They won our Scotland Award last year for planning excellence with their work around place efficiency assessment. They talked to 5,500 young people in their city. And that is the start of a conversation with young people in the city about what the city should look like. And they want to carry on the conversation as they produce their LDP. And I think that's a really powerful example of actually what has changed with NPF4 and the Planning Act. So there are some really big things that have happened. But we need that to be replicated. And in a big authority, it's easier to do that than in a small authority, which only has 2 people in its local plan team. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Does Claire want to ask anything on that? No, okay. Okay, fine. My second question is then, you've touched on the local development plan, and the committee have heard concerns and evidence from when it has the local development plan has been rejected at the gate check and returned to the planning authority for further work. And we're trying to ascertain why that's happening and what needs to change to ensure that planning authorities are submitting evidence reports that meet the requirements, because they're obviously not meeting the requirements. And you've touched on that some of the larger ones have a team of people and smaller ones have only a number of people. But there has to be something fundamentally wrong if even the larger ones are having theirs returned. And there's a mismatch somehow when it gets to the gate check that things are not progressing. So it would be good to get a flavour of what you think of that. Maybe Pamela first and then go on to Caroline.
I suppose that, it is a new system. So we're all working with this new system. And I think, some of the ones that were returned were actually based not round themes. The themes seem to get through the gate check, while where it was more a place-based approach, those were sort of returned on that. So I know that we're all learning from what has went before. So I think as sort of more authorities come to that stage on that, hopefully less will be rejected, and we've then determined what is what's required in terms of that stage and in terms of what the reporter is looking for. And I know that both Scottish Government, HOPS, RTPI have done some work around that, on that, because I think it came it was difficult for those authorities that thought, right, this is going to get through the gate check, and then when it was returned on that, and she said that some authorities, the big authorities can take that, but when it's a small authority and you have that very sort of tight timeline, that's really difficult to take forward.
Okay. Caroline.
I think there's learning on both sides, from the reporter side as well as from the local authority, about, again, interpreting what's the expectations are, and then what things look like in practice and what good looks like. So it has been very frustrating, and obviously the slippage in those for those local plan teams is very tricky. But yeah, we all have to press forwards. We only have to, we can only go forwards from where we are. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey with a number of questions.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everybody. Thanks so far for all your responses to the questions. We've touched on planning resources a wee bit in previous questions there, but I wanted to ask you more broadly about that. Do you see planning resources increasing a wee bit since NPF4 arrived, or is it pretty much as it was before? And you'll be delighted to know there's been some discussion about ring fencing of planning fees. No sooner had we thought we got rid of ring fencing, but it's come back again, like the tide, to suggest to us that we should ring fence planning fees for planning departments and so on. So just your views on planning resources in at large, and whether we think that's improving, and what's your views on the ring fencing of planning fees. Pamela, you start.
Okay, certainly, the increase in planning fees has been welcomed on that, but it's often determined by the number of applications coming in the door on that, and largely sort of income has largely been quite steady on that, even though the planning fees have increased. Don't need to tell you about sort of the issues that local government are facing in terms of resourcing on that, and financial resourcing on that. And, you know, each sort of service is expected to give up savings each year, so it's getting harder and harder. On that, we've talked about sort of often authorities are putting a lot of resource into the development management side of it on that, because that's where the pressure is. And then we have these very sort of, you know, light local development plan team, and some, you talked about the conditions on that. You know, some authorities have taken away their enforcement officers, and conditions aren't being sort of, you know, enforced and monitored. And, you know, what's the point in putting on conditions if you're not going to monitor and enforce them on that? In terms of ring fencing of planning fees, I think that's something that HOPs have always advocated for on that. It certainly would strengthen the planning system sort of going forward in terms of having those planning fees coming in. But again, you know, planning fees in Scotland are still well below what's in sort of England and Wales on that. So it wouldn't meet full cost sort of recovery as yet.
Caroline, any view on that?
I think, you know, we have seen very welcome changes around increases in planning fees, and also the indexation now. So we'll have an annual uplift. That's very, very helpful. But those fees, and, you know, for our members who are in the public sector who are trying to get planning consents, they say we're happy to pay a higher fee if we get a better service. And ring fencing they see as a kind of way of helping to kind of protect the budget and get it reinvested. But of course, development management planning applications are only one part of the system. And so from an institute's point of view, we also want to say about the resourcing of the other bits of the system. And we've talked already about the LDP slippage and the size of the LDP teams. And so there's a question about the resourcing of those other parts of the system, not just in local authorities, but also in some of our key agencies, statutory bodies, statutory consultees. That is also slowing things up, not being able to get responses on planning applications. And so there, you know, it is very welcome what has happened already, but we still have an issue around resourcing in multiple parts of the system. And I think there's we need to be cautious about the idea that ring fencing will solve everything. You know, it could be very good in some places for development management. It could be very helpful. But it doesn't fund everything. And so there's a question about the resource for the other parts of the planning system. And I just wanted to kind of also, what was the other point I was going to make about planning resources? We've got some welcome, you know, government commitments around planning resource in terms of the bursaries and their future planner scheme. So we need to have really nice jobs for those people to go into. So we need local authorities to be able to recruit planners and create posts for those planners to come in and, you know, help deliver all of the things we need them to deliver. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Is there any other?
Claire and Neil. So Claire and then Neil.
I'll be brief. Yeah, I was just a bit concerned about the programme for government when it talks about undertaking rapid audits of planning teams in each of the key agencies, and I'm not quite sure what that means and whether that's going to be a little bit of a bonfire with quangos like it's been happening down south. I hope not, but I request and reiterate what Caroline and Pam are saying about resourcing other parts of the system, and that includes the agencies and the ecologist services. You know, when we've looked at planning applications that have been major planning applications, we haven't seen any ecologists being involved in even big, complex applications sometimes, and that's really worrying, because you're worrying that maybe they haven't got the resources to do that. And in terms of, I think the the DPEA have recruited, but I think if you want to encourage people into planning, then we have to stop talking about it's a system for, this focus on speeding it up. And, we want to talk about, recruiting planners to make quality places, not just about sort of being bots to approve planning permissions.
What Claire's just said, my concern is that planners aren't doing planning. They're doing lots of other things. And when I started 30 odd years ago, it was normal to meet planners regularly and discuss what you're trying to achieve before the development the proposal was completed. Now, it's very, very difficult to do that now. I do count a number of planners as friends up in the Highlands, and I've also run an organisation with 50 people in it. And the question is, how do you motivate people to do good work, to work efficiently, to have high morale, this type of thing? So I think there are some questions around that. Leadership is important, obviously. But I think one of the issues which we see time and time again, and I'm not talking about major developments here, I'm talking about relatively small developments, say 10 houses in a small settlement somewhere in the Highlands. We have a never-ending internal single issue kind of representations, just going on and on with one objection after the next. I'm talking about, the single issues around flood risk or roads or trees or whatever. These are all important, but they keep coming in time and time again. It holds applications up for months and months, whereas the community has one opportunity for representations, and it's time limited. So I think it can't be very motivating for planners to continually have to deal with this never-ending round of consultations, and everyone gets frustrated as a result. Needless to say, the community and everyone else. So I think, for a started planners to do planning, I think to have more control over that process and to be able to say, right, we've given everyone an opportunity now. We have to make a decision, frankly, and move things on, because things are just taking too long, given all the pressures that communities face. So that's my thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Kenny, I'll just put these two questions together, if that's okay. It's just to ask your views on the government's ideas behind the planning hub and the National Plan and Improvement Champion. Are these ideas something that you would welcome as making a contribution to taking NPF4 forward locally? So just appreciate your ideas on that.
Yeah, certainly two things. The planning hub certainly is welcomed. It's at its early stage on that, and again, HOPs have been working with Scottish Government and RTPI of trying to shape that planning hub going forward. I think, the planning hub is there to assist sort of local authorities going forward on that, and that must be at the forefront of the planning. So having those sort of rich discussions of what sort of local authorities need, and certainly in the last few weeks we've had some good discussions about whether it's recruitment and sharing of skills, or whether it's local development plan slippage on that, so it can provide sort of critical assistance there. In terms of the National Planning Champion on that improvement, I think we're just about there with phase 1. So the phase 1, and we're looking towards phase 2 on that, and that certainly has been a good sort of exercise in terms of going through that process and having that improvement action plan. I think the critical thing is how planning authorities take forward these improvement action plans, and making sure that they are monitored on that and evaluated, and also we all learn from what's coming forward in terms of the improvement action plans on that. I know that, and I'll just get it in here, that I have the HOPS conference on Thursday in Kilmarnock, and we have a session on the Friday with all chief planners and our national planning improvement champions coming along to that, and we'll have a good discussion, and chief planners there, Fiona Simpson and Andy Kinnairds there, about how we're going to take forward phase 2 and 3 of the national planning improvement framework.
Views on that, Caroline?
Yeah, and in fact, that was one of the things I was going to touch on in my last answer, was about the work of the National Planning Improvement Champion and the value that, you know, the work that's gone on over the last 12 months or so in those improvement plans. And I think there's a really critical stage which is coming next, which is to analyse across all of the authorities and draw out the general lessons. And there may be things in there to feed into and back into the planning hub, for example, because some of the things, you know, will be outside, or some of the issues may be things that the Scottish Government can help with, not necessarily every authority trying to solve all of the problems for themselves. But the planning hub creates a space, I suppose, for additional resource to be drawn down, whether that's expertise, guidance, knowledge, assistance, filling a gap when a post is vacant. So can the planning hub help support in the interim? And I think, as Pamela has mentioned, there's been quite a few conversations to try and shape the planning hub so that it does help, that it actually provides the type of resource that will assist authorities you know, to actually, you know, to make a difference. And I think that's really important. There was, I suppose, a danger that the planning hub could just become something and not actually deliver anything. And I think that's the stakeholders and the conversations have been trying to shape it so it does help on the ground. And I think I mentioned earlier the idea that the planning hub could kind of convene around particular policies to provide a safe space for authorities to ask questions, have conversations with each other about interpreting specific policies. And we didn't really answer your question about that, I think, but I think there's definitely a role for the planning hub to do that sort of work, again, to help then delivery on the ground and consistency across authorities. Yeah.
Thanks,
so we're you know, Planning Hub has got a lot of potential, and we really value the work of the National Planning Improvement Champion, and we're really keen to see that taken forward in a really meaningful way. But we need that kind of analysis, cross-cutting analysis, to help us do that.
Thanks, Caroline. Is there anybody else online?
No one has indicated.
No. Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And now I'm going to bring in Emma Roddick.
Convener. Good morning to the panel. Looking again at the kind of workforce resourcing issues, I know that the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland has called for a significant rollout of master plan consent areas across Scotland to reduce some of the administrative burden, and in a hope that it would speed up decision making. Do you support that suggestion, and do you believe that it would indeed speed up decision making?
Master plan consent areas have their place, but they are not suitable in all places, and they require upfront resource, and they put quite a lot of burden on authorities that engage with them. And we know there are some authorities that are very keen on our taking forward MCAs, and others that were kind of reserving their judgment. Again, we come back to capacity and resources, supporting a master plan consent area, or trying to support multiple master plan consent areas isn't necessarily going to be easy or quick. So I think, yeah, they have a place, they have a role to play, but they are not suitable in all circumstances, and they are by no means a silver bullet. Whilst we sympathise with the perspective of RIAS, we don't see it as a sort of across the board solution. Yeah,
I would agree with what Caroline's saying. In in certain circumstances, they may be a good solution, but they do require a lot of resourcing up front. Will they result in quicker development on the ground? I think the jury's out on that. I am a great supporter of master plans on that, but I don't think it's suitable for every site or every development or each council on that certain sites. And I think you're talking about maybe quite a large site, sort of taking forward a master plan on that. But that's not to stop you doing that in terms of the planning permission in principle. A lot of them now come in as master plans consents. But I think, you know, behind the master plan consent areas is that the fact that you're delivering much quicker on the ground, but you're probably spending a lot of time at the sort of that stage of taking that forward, and I don't know whether that's going to save you time in the long run. Having rich pre-application discussions may be a more better solution of that, where you're having, you know, you're addressing all the issues before the application comes in, and then you've got your fair wind once the application comes in. Again, it's at a very early stage in terms of the master plan consent areas. I know that there's fees now associated with that. I'm not really aware of sort of a great sort of demand out there from developers to take that forward. Most want to go through the traditional route.
And Neil would like to come in online. Looks like Neil, it looks like you're up. Oh, no.
Yeah,
okay.
That's fine. Yeah, thanks for the question. We've been involved over a number of years in master plan work, and there's a great opportunity to bring communities into the discussion during that. I would talk very strongly in favour of master plans personally, and particularly when there's a great opportunity actually for collaboration at all levels, including strategic planners. And we've had these adopted, for example, in Murray Council, and that led to relatively modest development of 20 houses, whatever, but made a big difference. It was time consuming, took some time, but the landowner was keen to deliver a really quality development. So that was the mechanism in which we used, and I think, well, we've used it in rural areas as well. It allows people to voice their opinions. It gets people involved in planning. I think it's a great thing. So yeah, I would strongly suggest it's another opportunity that we should be using. Thanks.
Claire.
If you remember, they were initially called simplified planning zones, and then they were sort of rebadged as master plan consent areas. I'd quite like to rebadge them again to better planning zones or community collaborated planning zones, because as Neil was indicating, there's a potential there for collaboration, and I think this is a really good example where doing public-led planning that builds community wealth rather than buying land to build community assets through land reform. So it could be a powerful tool for community engagement in becoming developers themselves even. So.
Thank you very much for that. I notice as well the RTPI has asked that PF4 be made a dynamic document, so continually updated to reference any new advice as it's published. How might that work in practice, particularly as any amendments to it are subject to parliamentary approval?
Yes, I think I should take that, shouldn't I? We're not suggesting that amendments don't go through a process. It's more about the presentation of NPF4 in the light of the continuing issuance of guidance. We had a Chief Planner letter very recently on Policy 22. We had the guidance on climate resilience last week. These are not linked to NPF4. So if you look at the text of NPF4, those new bits of guidance, those clarifications in the form of those letters and supporting documents are not linked to the policies. And that's what we were arguing for, so that you don't miss things. You don't miss a chief planner letter, for example, which may clarify the interpretation of a particular policy. And that's really what we're just talking about. And again, Pamela talked earlier on about LDPs and using digital, sort of having a digital plan. And we'd love to see that with NPF4. So rather than having a static PDF document, having it on a web platform that allows you to then link through to these other policy areas inside and outside planning, because of course NPF4 is helping to deliver many of the Scottish Government's other ambitions. So yes, it's important to link to those new documents when they emerge, whether that's in relation to housing or transport or something else, nature networks, whatever it is. So that's what we meant, and that's what we still argue for and think would be a really great evolution of NPF4 and how it can be implemented. It would help everyone to have it all in one place and up to date.
Yeah, certainly I would support that, with working on the ground on that, and as more guidance and chief planner letters come forward on that, then it becomes cluttered on that. So certainly would support what the RTPI is proposing.
I can see it now, a wonderful website with clickable things that pop up, and you can see it all. It's all connected. Great suggestion. I'm now going to bring in Fulton McGregor, who's joining us online with a couple of questions.
Thanks, convener. And good morning to the panel. My question is around about NPF4. Do you believe that it supports a gender-sensitive approach? And if not, how do you think more can be done to improve that? As I'm not in the room, convener, I'm quite happy for you to go through who wants that.
Yeah. Anybody want to take that? Pamela? Just start.
I suppose it isn't mentioned specifically on that. I suppose it's your sort of interpretation of how you take forward sort of placemaking on that. And again, it could be linked to the policy in terms of placemaking. I think there's some really good work that's being done both in Glasgow and Edinburgh on that, and it's rolling that out to the other sort of planning authorities on that. Again, that's probably a role for the planning hub, again providing that sort of guidance, but also providing that sort of capacity building, that training on that, to sort of take that forward on that. I suppose as planners we should always be sensitive to that when we're discussing development proposals and in terms of the new LDPs coming forward.
Great. I'm going to, if no one else has got anything new and different to add.
One thing, which is, I don't think NPF4 is standing in the way of that. There's a strong emphasis in NPF4 on inclusion and equalities, and I think that's enough for authorities and anyone else that wants to take forward specifically gender-sensitive work. So it provides a platform. Yeah.
Okay. Fulton, do you want to ask the last question?
Yeah, thanks, convener, and thanks for those answers from the panel. My last question is, I suppose, one that could give an opportunity for people to sum up a wee bit as well, and that is, how do the panel think that this committee can focus future NPF4 scrutiny to ensure that it targets areas of concern to communities and stakeholders? And I wonder on this one, convener, if I could come to Claire Simmons first, because Claire, I know that you and I have done a wee bit of joint work with a local organisation in my constituency, the Northern Corridor Community Forum, who have often felt at times that their views and thoughts have not been taken into account. So this question is particularly of importance to me. What can this committee do to make sure that communities feel heard in the NPF4 process?
Thank you. Nice to see you, Fulton. Yeah, I think it's focusing the monitoring of outcomes rather than sort of asking us, let's have some proper, you know, resourced and maybe get some of the universities in to look at is it actually delivering, and bringing them in with some evidence-based how well are they delivering, but also as you so rightly say, communities are still really left out in the cold on planning. So there's the wider set of things that the planning system as a whole needs to deliver, and that is of course giving communities much more power. And we are still asking for an equal right of appeal, so that that balances out the planning system, and we think that will help change the balance of power within the system that it so desperately needs, because communities don't get that voice that they should. So,
thanks for that, Claire. Anybody else want to give us a little guidance on our future sessions around NPF4 or the next committee that takes on this role? Caroline,
do you want to? You go.
Okay, Pamela.
Yeah, I agree with Claire about sort of the monitoring of outcomes. I think is critical on that, and it's how the policies are being implemented on the ground and what is it delivering in terms of on the ground. Like we started off with biodiversity, and it's going the full circle on that, is seeing what has been delivered in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate resilience developments. We talked about the housing again, is sort of that sort of monitoring and evaluation of sort of, again, are we delivering the housing numbers, but also equally important is the quality of the sort of housing. Talked about communities. I would disagree. I think communities have a big part to play in terms of NPF4 and getting involved in the planning system and in the LTPs. The issue, and it's very frustrating for planners, is that often there is we don't have that involvement of communities on that. When we go out, we get 4 or 5 sort of people turning up, or sort of replying to sort of an online sort of survey on that. As planners, we're trying to adapt of sort of going to, whether it's going to the local fair or something like that, or going out to sort of different groups to try and involve sort of communities. I think it's changing the image of planning going forward, so that communities can feel that they can get involved. And for me, the local place plans and the narrative around that is really critical in terms of getting our communities involved, so that they can realise that they have the power to influence local development plans and how they can shape their community.
Great. Anybody else? Caroline?
I mean, I agree with Pamela, and I think it's very useful to have this annual review. That's a useful thing in itself, but I think there's a question about what happens to that review, and you make recommendations. What's the response? What is the update from the Scottish Government side? What has happened in the interim? And I think this reporting against outcomes and evidence, we've talked about evidence a number of times, but I think that's really important, so that these sessions aren't just a kind of finger in the wind, what do people think about this or feel about it, but actually, have we got any data? Have we got figures? There are some things in the system that you can quantify. There are other things that are harder, but, what is the evidence base? And I think that is really important, because we want NPF4 to work, and we want it to be up to date. There's going to be a question: at what point should NPF4 be reviewed? When should we amend it, or should it be amended? So that evidence base is going to be important in that, and I think this scrutiny plays a role in then helping to inform that decision about what happens with NPF4.
Can I dig into that a little bit? So there's some things that we can quantify. Could you give us maybe a couple of examples?
Clearly, we've got things about housing numbers, but
Yeah.
we've got these measures around biodiversity. What is the planning system delivering on that? Can we quantify it? In relation to 20-minute neighbourhoods, we've got new tools to help local authorities measure 20-minute neighbourhoods. So again, what evidence have we got that's being built up about how NPF4 is working on the ground? So those are just some things off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. Anybody online? Neil? Anybody want to give us a bit of direction there, Neil?
Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah, am I on, am I?
You are on, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the way to change perceptions is in private business, one has to promote oneself. We need, and so very often you need help. You need communications help with that. You need some PR help, and I think this is a fantastic story. NPF4, it's national priorities, it's government priorities reshaped. I mean, when you read the document, it's very encouraging. It's very positive. I mean, the folk on this call, obviously, and in the room, we've got specialists, immediate experience of things, and some of that's what we tend to do. It comes out with the kind of frustrations or whatever, and how we could improve things, but. Overall, we're living in exciting times. That there's all kinds of opportunities that have to flow from this. It's incredibly important planning, and I share the frustration of planners in that. Why aren't people more excited about it? So the only way to do that is to make it exciting. It's actually to actually reach out in a way that engages people, and I think that could happen. And there's definitely some good stories, but I don't expect, in the same sense that I'm not an expert in this, I would reach out and actually get someone to actually help with that. And I think perhaps the planning fraternity need to do that as well. They just need to get some advice on how best to communicate the successes and the dynamism around the what's going on in planning. Anyway, that's off the top of my head.
Thanks very much for that. I'll just pop in a response to that before I bring in Claire, which makes me think of the really great work that took place in Dumfries with the Stove Network. So that was an arts network that was engaged to engage the community on what did they want in terms of the future of the town centre of Dumfries. And that's given rise to one of my favourite community-led housing projects, which more mixed-use projects, which is the Mid-Steeple Quarter. So I think there's something there that maybe planners and kind of arts and culture sector could get together, because that kind of work, really finding ways to interpret something that maybe is a bit. I love Neil that you say that NPF4 is a great read and it's a great story, but so for some people that's not their language. So how do we kind of make it available to people on the ground? And there is something about the Stove Network's work where they were like right there in front of people with very engaging processes and artistic experiments to get people thinking about their communities. But Claire, you want to come in on telling us how we can do, I think, or maybe you already came in.
I did. I didn't actually have my hand up.
All right. Come on in.
Oh, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, you didn't have your hand up. All right. Okay. Do you want to say anything?
Anyway, I just come back to the point about equal rights of appeal, because I think our envisaging that is not to hold up planning and things, but it's to ensure if you've got a community that's engaged in the local development plan or have spent ages doing their local place plan, which has no kind of suggestion that it's going to influence the local development plan. But if a planning decision then can go against that development plan, then the communities have got nothing to challenge that with. There's no way that you can say, hang on, that decision was made badly, or it was misdirected, or there's nothing that they've got to come back on. And this is what we hear time and time again. People cannot believe that they don't have a right of appeal. It's grossly unjust that one sector has rights that another doesn't, and it's really important of people's perception of the planning system that they are seen as equal players, and that is the absolute epitome of and proof that they are seen as equal players. So I think that's the reason we are so keen to have it.
Thanks. We've got a couple of mop-up questions, so I'm going to bring in Willie, purpley mop-up. Right, he's going to ask a question to you, Pamela, and then I've got a question around 20-minute neighbourhoods and rural communities, and I'm going to direct that to Neil. So just putting you on alert. Okay.
Right, thanks, Convener Pamela. I probably need to ask you a question about the impact that NPF4 has already made, particularly in relation to flood risk assessment. Perhaps it's one of the unintended consequences of NPF4 that perhaps suddenly we have rendered housing settlements liable to increased flood risk through SEPA's flood risk assessment that weren't assessed as at risk of flood before. And it's how do you see that, and how can we possibly not get round that particular problem, but to manage that particular problem on behalf of residents who bought their house when it was not assessed as at risk of flood, and now it suddenly is.
Yeah, it is. It's one of my favourite subjects of MPF4 and Policy 22, and just the impact it is having on existing communities. And you'll be aware of, Kilmarnock on that. It's not just Kilmarnock, it's throughout Scotland, and just the impact it's having on sort of development proposals taking forward on that. MPF4 we've talked about today is very much pushing brownfield sites, and rightly so, on that, but often these brownfield sites are right in the floodplain on that. It is a really difficult situation in terms of policy 22. It is quite robust. SEPA are really robust in terms of this policy sort of going forward. There has been a short life working group on it, to be honest. Nothing fundamental has come out of it. It's more sort of addressing procedural issues, and maybe it's something that we do need to go back and review, because certainly it is impacting sort of housing coming forward. It's seen as one of the barriers of housing going forward. It's also in terms of taking brownfield sites, taking them sort of forward on that. It seems to be at the very extreme end, and that's just a personal view of that in terms of the policy, and I don't know whether there is scope to actually sort of provide some more robust guidance with this, or review the policy going forward on that. But certainly it's seen as a barrier going forward, and as a chief planning officer it's very difficult to go against SEPA. I know that the new sort of the chief planning officer's letter came out, said that councils can go against SEPA on that. I know that both in my own authority and in other authorities we have went against SEPA, but it tends to be very sort of small development on that. It isn't the bigger development, and I certainly would not like to see that as sort of a barrier, and against sort of town centre regeneration, taking forward town centre housing as well on that. So I do think there is some work to be done with that policy, with Scottish Government, with SEPA, and with sort of planning authorities taking it forward. We all face the same issues in terms of that policy.
Thanks very much for that, Pamela. Thank you.
Thanks. And then Neil, this is around 20-minute neighbourhood policies, but the rigid interpretation of MPF4 policies stifling development. So this question is specifically around the application of 20-minute neighbourhood policies being applied to remote rural developments. But I do remember at the time when 20-minute neighbourhoods were first kind of named in the very first draft, I think the Minister did take on board that that wouldn't be relevant to rural communities. So I'm surprised that this is coming forward as a concern, because I think they moved to language around sustainable communities or something like that, and weren't really necessarily rigidly saying rural communities had to be 20-minute neighbourhoods. But I just wonder if you have any awareness of how that's filtering down on the ground.
Well, I mean, the historical context of this is European cities. You know, this is where it came from originally, and Paris, I believe, and it makes an awful lot of sense. And what they're talking about there, and I'm not a planner, obviously, I'm a sort of business person, architect person, but my understanding is that what's the focus is a range of resources within a given area, both physical community contact, but also other things as well. What springs to mind in relation to a rural context is more local local produce, for example. I mean, we have to define what we mean by the benefit of a ring fence kind of area, whatever, whether it's a given time or physical distance or whatever. Having lived in rural areas much of my life, I think it would surprise a lot of urban people just how incredibly well connected they are in many respects, and people do know what other people are up to in a positive way. You know, it's a sort of self-defense kind of human thing. So I think, yeah, I'm surprised that it should be being applied to rural areas, but I think we need a sort of equal definition, which has different criteria, perhaps, in relation to it. What I'd like to see, in actual fact, and I spoke about this in recent times, is a bit more ambition around what rural centres are. I mean, historically in Scotland, we had this amazing movement in the 18th and 19th century called the planned villages, planned towns, and many of the places that we all love and enjoy now across Scotland, from Bowmore to Thurso to Faughibers, these are all planned towns. They didn't exist 200 years ago, and we need a similar ambition. These were the result of significant economic change and opportunity historically, and we have similar context now in terms of we need regenerative opportunities and approaches away from global supply chains to much more local ones. And the question is, what expression do we give that now? How do we actually build places, repair ecosystems, and actually build opportunities of employment and economic activity for people and visitors and all the rest? How do we do that today? You know, this is the question. I guess the question that NPF4 is there to guide. It's all in there. I think we just need to crack on and find a way to actually get stuff done more rapidly, more quickly, and collaboratively. I'd love to work with planners again, more directly, and get stuff done. And I'm sure communities want to do that as well. So I think that's maybe a nice place for me to end.
Thanks very much for that. And yes, I think it's quite a nice challenge there around how do we revision Scotland to be more regenerative with local supply chains, and build places that also repair ecosystems in a collaborative approach. So sounds good. Let's do it. And if NPF4 is the underpinning of that, or the framework for that, that's good news. And clearly it is a process. I think we started right out at the beginning here, Caroline, with you talking about it takes time. Planning takes time. These changes will take time. So it's good to come in here today and get a little kind of sense check on this piece of work that we've been doing. And we are considering doing actually a focused piece of work on local place plans maybe later in the year, just to kind of unearth the good work that's being done by communities in that space. But that concludes our questions, and so I give my thanks to our witnesses for joining us this morning and for their evidence, and I'm now going to briefly suspend the meeting before our next item. Thank you. We now turn to item 3 on the agenda, and that is to consider 2 negative instruments. And the first one is Evaluation Proposals Procedures Scotland Regulations 2025 SSI 2025/146. Do any members have any comments on the instrument? No one has any comments. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. The second SSI is the Town and Country Planning Fees for Appeals Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 SSI 2025/166. Do members have any comments on this instrument? No one has any comments. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And we have previously agreed to take the next item in private, so as that was the last public item on our agenda today, that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we will move into private.